A gang threatens an elderly woman's ranch, unaware that her grandson is an elite Special Forces fighter. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching us from. The Texas sun rose over Black Creek Ranch, casting golden light across the sprawling land. The fields stretched endlessly, framed by the rolling hills and distant clusters of oak trees. The morning air carried the scent of dry earth and cattle, the familiar perfume of a land that had endured for generations. Margaret Meg Johnson stood on the wide wooden porch of the house that had been in her family for over a century. She gripped a steaming cup of coffee, the ceramic warm against her weathered hands. At 79 years old, Meg had lived through droughts, recessions, and the changing tides of the ranching business. She had seen good men rise and bad men fall, but through it all, she had kept Black Creek standing. Her father had built this house with his own hands, just as his father had tilled the first fields. It was more than just land. It was history. It was her family's blood, sweat, and sacrifice. And as long as she was alive, she would not let anyone take it away. Meg took a slow sip of coffee and glanced at the sky. The weather was good today, but she had learned long ago that storms didn't always come in the form of thunderclouds. Some came on the back of trucks, carrying men with cruel eyes and bad intentions. For months now, trouble had been spreading like a sickness through the county. Ranchers whispering in town, shops closing earlier, once friendly neighbors keeping their doors locked. Everyone had heard the stories. Some had even lived them. It had started quietly. Discreet offers to buy up land, always above market price, always in cash. Then the threats came. The accidents. Barns mysteriously catching fire in the dead of night. Cattle poisoned. Farmers beaten up outside bars. The message was clear. Sell or suffer. The ones behind it called themselves the White Sons, a group of men who believed they had the right to decide who could own land in this part of Texas. They preached about heritage and purity, but Meg knew what they really were: thieves in cowboy boots. She had watched them take over the neighboring McCarthy ranch. Old Joe McCarthy had refused to sell, same as she did, until one night he woke to find his prize horses slaughtered in their stalls. 2 weeks later, he packed up and left. But Meg wasn't Joe McCarthy. She wasn't leaving. A gust of wind rolled over the fields, rustling the dry grass. In the distance, the cattle were calm, unaware of the storm brewing on the horizon. She tightened her grip on the coffee cup and took a slow breath. That was when she heard the truck. The rumble of tires against the dirt road reached her ears long before she saw them. She didn't move, didn't flinch. She simply set her coffee cup down on the wooden railing and waited. The vehicle appeared over the hill, a dust trail rising behind it. It was a battered old pickup, its dull blue paint scarred by time and neglect. A second truck followed behind it, then a third. She knew who they were before they even stopped. The lead truck pulled to a halt right at the edge of her property. The doors swung open and men stepped out. They dressed like ranchers, but there was something wrong in the way they carried themselves. Too confident, too entitled, too sure that nothing could stop them. Meg recognized the man who stepped out first. Travis Coyote Barlow. A tall, broad-shouldered man with sharp features and cold blue eyes. His cowboy hat sat at a cocky angle on his head, and a smirk tugged at his lips as he adjusted the belt on his jeans. He looked like the kind of man who had spent his life getting what he wanted. He had the arrogance of someone who had never been told no. Meg had no intention of being the first to flatter his ego. Barlow walked forward, his boots crunching against the dry ground. Two of his men flanked him, both younger, both with the kind of lazy cruelty in their eyes that made her skin crawl. Meg remained still. Barlow tipped his hat slightly. "Mrs. Johnson," he greeted, his voice smooth, practiced, insincere. "It's a fine morning, ain't it?" Meg didn't answer. He chuckled. "You know, I always admired your spirit. Ain't a lot of folks around here willing to stand their ground like you do." Still, she said nothing. Barlow's smile didn't reach his eyes. "I figured I'd come by, have a little chat, see if you might have had a change of heart." Meg finally spoke. "I told you before, Mr. Barlow, this land isn't for sale." Barlow sighed, shaking his head as if disappointed. "Now, Meg, I respect your pride, I do, but pride don't pay taxes, and it sure as hell don't keep you safe." One of the men behind him chuckled. Meg's expression remained unreadable. "You done?" Barlow's smirk faded just a fraction. He studied her as if searching for a crack in her resolve. Then his voice lowered. "I'd hate for anything to happen to you out here, ma'am. You're getting up there in years. Accidents happen. Rattlesnakes in the barn. Unattended fires in the dry season. Hard life for a woman alone." Meg didn't blink. "You threatening me, Mr. Barlow?" His smile returned, wider now. "Me? No, ma'am. Just stating facts." She exhaled slowly, letting the silence stretch between them. Then she took a single step forward. "You think I'm alone?" Barlow hesitated just for a second, just long enough for Meg to see the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. She didn't say anything else. She didn't have to. After a moment, Barlow nodded, stepping back. "Well, I won't take up any more of your time," he said, "but you think on my offer. Clock's ticking." He turned and walked back to his truck. His men followed, though not before one of them spit on the ground near her porch. The engines roared to life, the trucks kicking up dust as they peeled away. Meg stood there, watching them until they disappeared over the ridge. Then, and only then, did she allow her hands to tremble. She glanced at the empty coffee cup on the railing, then reached into the pocket of her worn jeans. Her fingers found the phone she had memorized but never used, the phone of a man she hadn't seen in years. Her grandson, her last hope. She pressed the call button. It rang once, twice. Then a voice answered, deep and calm, edged with steel. "Gran?" Meg took a steadying breath. "James," she said, "it's time." The desert stretched for miles, an endless sea of sand and dry earth, interrupted only by the occasional rise of rock formations carved by centuries of wind. The road, cracked and bleached by the sun, wound through the landscape like an old scar, leading nowhere and everywhere at once. The heat shimmered in the air, turning the horizon into a wavering mirage. James J. Williams rode fast, his motorcycle roaring against the silence of the wasteland. He had been pushing hard since dawn, the urgency in his grandmother's voice still fresh in his mind. She had always been strong, steady as the land itself, but there had been something in the way she spoke, something just beneath the surface of her words. A warning. A quiet plea for help disguised as a simple statement. It had been 3 years since he last set foot on Black Creek Ranch. 3 years since he had seen the house where he had grown up, the land that had once felt like a prison, but now called to him with a force he couldn't ignore. He had left at 18, eager to escape, to carve his own path, and he had done just that. The military had taken him to places most people only heard about in passing news reports. War zones, covert operations, the kind of missions that never made it into official records. He had built himself into a weapon, honed by fire and blood, a man who could disappear into the night and reappear only when the job was done. But now, none of that mattered. What mattered was the voice of the only family he had left, calling him home. He pushed the throttle harder, the engine responding with a deep growl. The wind tore at his face, but he barely noticed. He had already crossed into Texas hours ago, the miles falling away beneath him in a blur. Every stretch of land he passed was familiar, every hill and dry creek bed a piece of a world he had tried to leave behind. The town of Clearwater appeared on the horizon, small and unassuming, just as he remembered it. The same tired gas station at the edge of town, the same old diner with its rusting neon sign flickering weakly against the glare of the afternoon sun. But there was something different now, something heavier in the air. It wasn't just the heat. It was tension, the kind that settled deep into the bones of a place when people started living in fear. He slowed as he reached the main street. Shops that had once been bustling were now half empty, their windows plastered with signs announcing early closing hours. A few men stood outside the bar, their eyes tracking him as he passed, their conversations quieting. He recognized the look. He had seen it before, in places where danger was an unspoken rule, where survival depended on knowing when to speak and when to stay silent. Pulling into the gas station, he killed the engine and stepped off the bike, rolling his shoulders to loosen muscles stiff from the long ride. The attendant, an older man with deep lines etched into his face, glanced at him once and then quickly looked away, as if recognizing trouble before it even arrived. Jay filled the tank, his senses sharp despite the exhaustion creeping into his limbs. He had spent too many years training himself to notice the small things, the nervous glances, the way a man's hand hovered just a little too close to his belt, the way people avoided eye contact. There was fear here, not the kind that came from bad business or hard times, but the kind that settled in when people realized that help wasn't coming. As he walked into the convenience store to grab a bottle of water, he felt the weight of eyes on him. He turned slightly, catching the reflection in the glass door. 3 men stood near the shelves, pretending to browse, but their focus was on him. Locals, probably. Maybe connected to the group his grandmother had warned him about, or maybe just men who didn't like strangers. Jay let them watch. He had no interest in starting a fight, not here, not now. But if they wanted one, he would end it before any of them had time to regret it. The cashier, a woman in her 40s with tired eyes, gave him a wary glance as he set the bottle on the counter. "You passing through?" she asked, ringing up the purchase. "Just visiting family," he replied evenly. She hesitated, then lowered her voice. "Be careful." He studied her for a moment, then nodded. Message received. Back outside, he took a long drink from the bottle, letting the cool water chase away the dust in his throat. The men inside hadn't followed him out, but he could still feel the weight of their presence lingering in the air. He slid his sunglasses back onto his face, climbed onto the bike, and revved the engine. Clear water faded behind him as he took the road leading out to Black Creek Ranch. The landscape became more familiar with every mile, the land flattening into golden fields, the sky stretching wider than anywhere else in the world. And then, at the crest of a hill, he saw it. The house stood strong against the backdrop of the open sky, its wooden beams weathered but sturdy. The barn, the fence line, the vast stretch of land beyond, it was all the same, yet somehow different. It felt smaller than he remembered, but no less important. This was home, no matter how long he had been gone. As he rolled up the long dirt driveway, he spotted a figure standing on the porch. Meg. She was exactly as he remembered her, and yet time had left its marks. Her frame seemed smaller, but there was still steel in the way she stood, in the set of her jaw, in the way she folded her arms as she watched him approach. He stopped the bike and dismounted, dust kicking up around his boots as he walked toward her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, finally, she said, "Took you long enough." He let out a breath, a slow grin tugging at the corner of his lips. "Yeah, guess it did." She looked him over, as if assessing whether the boy she had raised was still somewhere inside the man who had returned. Whatever she saw, it was enough. She nodded, then turned toward the door. "Come inside. We got work to do." Jay followed her, stepping onto the porch, feeling the weight of years between them settle into something familiar, something steady. He didn't know what he had expected when he got her call, but now that he was here, he knew one thing for certain. Whatever had come for his grandmother, whatever was threatening to take her land, her home, he was going to stop it. And this time, he wasn't leaving until the job was done. The house smelled like coffee and old wood, like memories soaked into the walls over generations. Jay stepped inside, feeling the weight of time settle around him. The kitchen was exactly as he remembered, modest, practical, with its heavy oak table at the center, the same checkered curtains over the windows filtering in the afternoon light. It was a place that had always felt safe. But now the safety was an illusion, and both he and Meg knew it. She moved with quiet efficiency, setting 2 mugs on the table before filling them from the percolator. Jay pulled out a chair, watching her in silence as she poured. She was slower now, more deliberate, but there was still no hesitation in her movements. Age had taken some of her strength, but none of her resolve. She slid his cup toward him and sat down across the table. Outside, the land stretched endlessly toward the horizon, bathed in the golden light of the setting sun. He let the quiet settle between them before speaking. "How bad is it?" Meg took a sip of her coffee, her fingers wrapped around the mug. "Bad enough." She set the cup down, exhaling slowly. "They've been making their way through the county for the past year. Started with the smaller farms, the ones that were already struggling. First came the offers, way more than the land was worth. Some folks took the money and left." She paused, shaking her head. "The ones who didn't? Fires, broken fences, cattle gone missing. Then the real threat started." Jay listened, his jaw tightening. He had read about organized land grabs before. Gangs or corporations pushing people out of their homes through intimidation. It was nothing new. But here, in this place, in his grandmother's backyard, it was personal. "McCarthy gave in after they gutted his stable," Meg continued, "burned it to the ground. They sent a few of their boys to Anderson's place, roughed him up real bad outside the feed store. Now, he don't go anywhere without a shotgun in his truck." Jay could picture it. Bill Anderson had been a friend of the family for decades. He wasn't the kind of man who scared easy. If he was carrying a shotgun, it meant things were worse than Meg was letting on. "And you?" Jay asked. Meg's lips pressed into a thin line. "They tried a few times, left dead coyotes on the porch, shot up the barn 2 weeks back." She met his gaze evenly. "Told me I had until the end of the month to sell or else." Jay didn't need to ask what or else meant. He leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. His mind was already working through the problem, picking it apart like a mission briefing. "They'll come again," he said, "sooner than you think. They know I'm here now." Meg nodded. "Figured as much. We need to be ready." He wasn't talking about locking the doors or calling the sheriff. No, this required something else entirely. Meg watched him over the rim of her cup. "What are you thinking?" Jay exhaled, staring at the wall for a moment before looking back at her. "I'm thinking we turn this place into a fortress." Jay spent the next 2 days assessing the land, mapping out vulnerabilities, looking at the ranch the way he would a military outpost. He took stock of what they had: fencing, supplies, weapons. Meg wasn't unarmed. She had a Winchester rifle that had been passed down through the family, a couple of shotguns, even an old revolver she kept in the drawer by the stove. But none of it was enough for what was coming. He made trips into town, visiting old friends, gathering information. He didn't go to the sheriff's office. He already knew the answer he'd get. If the law could do something about this, they would have by now. Instead, he found Bill Anderson at the diner, nursing a cup of coffee like it was the only thing keeping him upright. The bruises on his face were still fading, his knuckles scabbed over from whatever fight he'd put up when the bastards jumped him. Jay slid into the booth across from him. Bill looked up, his tired eyes sharpening as he recognized him. "Didn't think I'd see you back here," Bill said. "Didn't think I'd have to come back," Jay replied. Bill grunted, taking a sip from his cup. "Guess that makes 2 of us." Jay got straight to the point. "Tell me what you know about Barlow and his people." Bill leaned back, rubbing a hand over his jaw. "More than I care to, less than I need to." He set his cup down, fingers tapping against the ceramic. "They ain't just some local troublemakers, Jay. They got connections, out-of-state money, military surplus gear. Hell, I wouldn't be surprised if half the sheriff's office is on their payroll." Jay absorbed that. He had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed meant they were on their own. "You standing with us?" Jay asked. Bill snorted. "Boy, if you're asking whether I got any fight left in me, I'll remind you I was running cattle before you were born. And I ain't about to let those bastards run me out of my own damn home." Jay nodded. That was all he needed to hear. He spent the next few hours gathering others. Not everyone was willing, but those who were made up for it in determination. There was Luis Garcia, whose father had built the biggest feed operation in the county. Kicked out of the military for a bar fight that left 3 men in the hospital. Cassie Wallace, who ran the bar at the edge of town, had a sawed-off shotgun under the counter and wasn't afraid to use it. A few other ranchers, tired of waiting for help that would never come. By nightfall, Jay had a dozen people willing to stand with him. Not enough for an army, but more than enough to make a fight of it. They met in the barn at Black Creek, gathered around an old workbench covered in maps and weapons. Jay laid out the plan. They would reinforce the fences, set up tripwires and floodlights. They would patrol the property, armed and ready. Most importantly, they would be waiting. Because Barlow and his men thought they were dealing with farmers. They had no idea they were walking into a war. The night was still when Jay stepped onto the porch, the air thick with the scent of dry grass and distant rain. He could feel it coming, the shift in the wind, the quiet before the first shot was fired. Meg sat in her rocking chair, her rifle across her lap, staring out at the land. "You think this is gonna work?" she asked. Jay didn't hesitate. "It's gonna have to." She gave a slow nod, her fingers running over the stock of her rifle like a prayer. "Guess we'll find out soon enough." Jay looked out at the darkness beyond the fences. Somewhere out there, Barlow and his men were waiting, planning. But they weren't the only ones. This time, when they came, they wouldn't find a frightened old woman standing alone. they would find something else entirely. The night settled over Black Creek Ranch in an uneasy silence. The wind had died, leaving the land eerily still, the kind of quiet that set the instincts on edge. The sky was dark, heavy with clouds that blotted out the stars. The air smelled of dust and dry grass, but beneath it lingered something else: anticipation. Jay stood at the edge of the property, his eyes scanning the horizon. He had spent enough time in combat zones to recognize the weight of impending violence. This was the moment before the storm, the breath held before the first shot. The others were in position. Bill Anderson and Luis Garcia were stationed near the main gate, armed and waiting. Cassie Wallace and a few of the others patrolled the barn and the surrounding fields, their silhouettes barely visible in the darkness. The floodlights had been rigged, the tripwires set, and the reinforced fencing was lined with makeshift barricades. Every approach had been accounted for, every potential weakness covered. They were outnumbered. That much was certain, but they weren't unprepared. Jay turned his head slightly, listening to the distant hum of an approaching engine. Not one, several. They were coming. He moved quickly, making his way back to the house. Meg was already on the porch, her rifle resting across her lap, her face unreadable in the dim light. She wasn't scared. If anything, she looked ready. "They're here," Jay said. Meg nodded once, as if she had expected nothing less. The first headlights appeared on the ridge, followed by a second, then a third. A line of trucks moving in slow, deliberate formation, their engines low and steady. They weren't trying to be quiet. They wanted to be seen. They wanted to remind everyone watching that they weren't afraid. Jay watched as the vehicles came to a stop just outside the gate. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, the driver's door of the lead truck swung open. Travis Barlow stepped out. The man looked different in the harsh glow of the headlights. Less like the charming menace he had pretended to be and more like what he truly was. Someone who had never faced real resistance before. Someone who had always assumed that power came from fear alone. Behind him, his men followed, fanned out along the fence line. They were armed, confident, certain that this would be another easy victory. Jay didn't move. He let them come. Barlow stopped just short of the gate, his hands resting on his belt. "Evening," he called out. His voice carried in the stillness, smooth and unhurried. "Figured you'd be expecting us." Jay said nothing. Barlow's smirk twitched. "Now, I'm a reasonable man," he continued. "I like to give folks a chance to do the right thing. So, here it is. Last chance. You pack up, walk away, and we let you leave in one piece." Jay let the silence stretch between them. Then, finally, he spoke. "You brought a lot of men, Barlow. You sure it's enough?" The smirk faltered, just for a second. Jay stepped forward, just enough to let the light catch his face. "I know the type of man you are. You win because people are too scared to fight back. But you made a mistake." Barlow's jaw tightened. "Yeah, and what's that?" Jay's voice was calm, steady. "You assumed we were afraid of you." Then the floodlights snapped on. The sudden burst of brightness lit up the entire field, exposing every man standing outside the fence. At the same moment, the first shot rang out, not from Jay, but from the barn. A single round, precise, striking the ground inches from the nearest truck's tires. A warning. Barlow's men reacted instinctively, scrambling for cover, weapons drawn, but there was nowhere to hide. From the house, the barn, the surrounding fields, the defenders of Black Creek Ranch made themselves known. Rifles rested against shoulders, eyes steady behind scopes. No panicked movements, no wasted motion. These weren't desperate farmers making a last stand. These were men and women who had spent the last 3 days preparing for this exact moment, and they had the high ground. For the first time, Barlow hesitated. He glanced around, realizing too late that the element of surprise had never been his. Jay saw the flicker of doubt across the man's face. "You're done here," Jay said. "Turn around while you still can." Barlow's fingers twitched at his side. For a moment, it seemed like he might back down, might take the out he had been given. Then one of his men, one of the younger, angrier ones, raised his rifle. The gunshot cracked through the night, and all hell broke loose. The defenders fired back in controlled, precise bursts. The attackers scrambled, caught off guard, their formation breaking apart. The trip wires were triggered, setting off flares and alarms, disorienting Barlow's men further. Jay moved fast, taking cover behind an old tractor as he fired into the fray. He didn't aim to kill, only to disable, to drive them back, to make them understand that this was not their land to take. Luis and Bill held the main gate, forcing the attackers to split their focus. Cassie took out the tires of one of the trucks, sending it veering sideways into a ditch. Barlow cursed, shouting orders, trying to regain control, but it was slipping away from him, slipping through his fingers like sand. Jay saw him retreating toward his truck, saw the frustration twist in his face. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. Barlow had come expecting a slaughter. Instead, he had found a fight. Another shot rang out, striking the ground near his feet. He froze. Jay stepped forward, his rifle steady. "It's over." Barlow's chest rose and fell, his mind racing for an escape, for a way to salvage his pride, but there was none. One by one, his men began to back away, dropping their weapons, realizing that this was a battle they could not win. Barlow's hands clenched into fists. His entire life had been built on control, on forcing others to bend. And now, standing here, he had lost everything. The sheriff's sirens wailed in the distance. Not that it mattered. This fight had already been decided. Jay lowered his rifle. "Get off my land." Barlow hesitated for a fraction of a second longer, then turned on his heel. He climbed into his truck, slamming the door shut. The rest of his men followed. Engines roared to life, tires kicking up dirt as they sped away into the night. And just like that, it was over. The silence that followed was thick, heavy with something deeper than relief. The defenders of Black Creek stood motionless, watching the dust settle, listening to the distant hum of retreating engines. Then, slowly, one by one, they lowered their weapons. Jay exhaled, rolling his shoulders, feeling the tension bleed from his muscles. He turned toward the house, toward the woman standing on the porch. Meg met his gaze, her expression unreadable. Then she nodded. It was done. For the first time in a long time, Black Creek was safe. The first light of morning crept over the horizon, washing the land in hues of pale gold and muted orange. The storm of the night had passed, leaving only silence in its wake. Smoke still lingered in the cool air, remnants of gunfire and burning rubber dissipating into the vast Texas sky. The fields, once pristine, bore the scars of the battle. Tire tracks cut deep into the earth, shattered glass glinting in the early sunlight, the remnants of spent shell casings scattered like autumn leaves. Jay stood near the fence line, his rifle slung over his shoulder, watching as the town's sheriff finally arrived. It had taken them long enough. He'd expected that. Law enforcement in places like this always moved at their own pace, and in a county where men like Barlow had their fingers in too many pockets, justice was rarely swift. Sheriff Tom Denton stepped out of his cruiser, his face lined with something between exhaustion and frustration. He was a man past his prime, a relic of the days when keeping the peace meant turning a blind eye to trouble. His uniform was neatly pressed, his silver badge gleaming under the rising sun, but his hands fidgeted at his sides, a tell. He was uneasy. Jay waited, letting the sheriff make the first move. Denton cleared his throat. "Got reports of gunfire out here last night. Want to tell me what the hell happened?" Jay glanced toward the house. Meg was still on the porch, watching the exchange with a quiet, steady presence. The others, Bill, Luis, Cassie, stood nearby, arms crossed, their faces unreadable. "We defended ourselves," Jay said simply. Denton exhaled heavily, rubbing a hand over his face. "Jesus Christ, Williams, you know I can't just let this slide. There are laws." "Where were those laws last week when Barlow's men torched a barn?" Jay cut in. "Where were they when they beat Anderson half to death?" Denton had no answer. He shifted uncomfortably, kicking at the dirt with the toe of his boot. "You got bodies?" he asked after a moment. "No," Jay said. "We let them walk away. Unlike them, we don't kill for sport." Denton glanced at the bullet holes in the fence, at the abandoned weapons still scattered around the property. His jaw tightened. He knew damn well that if the situation had been reversed, Meg Johnson wouldn't have been given the same courtesy. He sighed. "Barlow's missing. No sign of him or his crew in town." Jay wasn't surprised. The man had taken his beating and run. But men like him didn't just disappear. He would surface again, licking his wounds, plotting his next move. For now, though, he was gone. Denton exhaled. "Look, I can't promise anything, but I'll make some calls, see if I can get the feds involved. There's enough here for an investigation. Might even stick this time." Jay didn't trust the words, but he nodded anyway. It was the best he was going to get. Denton turned to Meg. "You planning on pressing charges?" She smiled faintly, her hands resting on the arms of her rocking chair. "Sheriff, I think we both know charges don't mean much in this county." Denton grimaced. He tipped his hat toward her, then climbed back into his car. Jay watched as the cruiser pulled away, kicking up dust as it disappeared down the long dirt road leading back into town. For a moment, the silence returned. Then Bill let out a slow chuckle. That went about as well as expected. Jay smirked, shaking his head. Meg stood, stretching her arms as if shaking off the last remnants of tension. "Well," she said, "ain't no use standing around like statues. We got work to do." The others dispersed, moving across the ranch with the kind of unspoken understanding that came from shared hardship. There were fences to fix, bullet holes to patch, wreckage to clear. Jay lingered for a moment, taking it all in. This land had been on the brink of falling into the wrong hands, but now it stood, scarred but unbroken. And so did the people who had fought for it. Meg turned to him, studying him the way only she could. "You still planning on leaving?" Jay hesitated. That had been the plan, hadn't it? Show up, handle the threat, and disappear again. That was how he had lived for years, never staying too long, never putting down roots. But something was different this time. Maybe it was the way Meg had refused to back down. Maybe it was the look in Bill's eyes when he had realized they weren't fighting alone. Maybe it was the town itself, standing on the edge of something new, something stronger. Maybe it was just time. Jay met Meg's gaze. "Think I'll stick around a while?" She didn't smile, but there was something in her expression, something quiet and knowing. "Good," she said. "Could use an extra set of hands around here." Jay chuckled, shaking his head. The sun climbed higher, the morning stretching into the promise of a new day. There was work to be done, fences to rebuild, and a future to protect. And for the first time in a long time, Jay wasn't looking for the next road out. He was already home. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Check out more of our videos for even more thrilling stories, and if you think someone else would love this one, share it with them. Thanks for watching.